The courtroom was silent as a grave when Pearl Barrett slammed her hand flat against the judge's table and said the words that stopped Frank Bancroft's heart cold in his chest. That clock was wrong. 3 words. 3 simple words spoken in a voice as steady and certain as the Rocky Mountains themselves. And yet those 3 words detonated like a stick of dynamite right beneath the foundation of everything Frank had been so absolutely certain about for the past 72 hours. He stood near the back wall of the Redemption Creek courthouse, his silver sheriff's star catching the afternoon light that poured through the single dust-hazed window, and he felt the ground shift beneath his boots. "Ma'am," Judge Harlan Poole said from behind his elevated bench, his voice carrying the warning tone of a man who had not been interrupted in 20 years of service and did not intend to start tolerating it now. "You will address this court with proper procedure or you will be removed." Pearl Barrett did not look at the judge when he spoke. She looked at the man in the defendant's chair instead, a gaunt young man named Eli Marsh with hollow cheeks and frightened eyes who had spent 3 days in Frank's jail on a murder charge that carried a hanging sentence. Her dark brown eyes held something fierce and unwavering in them, something that Frank recognized from the first moment he had laid eyes on her and had never quite been able to name. It was certainty. The rare, clean, absolute kind of certainty that most people spent their entire lives only pretending to possess. The clock on the south wall of the Silver Star Saloon was running 11 minutes slow on the night of September the 3rd, 1882, Pearl said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room without any effort, as if she had been born to be heard in exactly this moment. Eli Marsh was seen leaving that saloon at what the witnesses claim was 9 o'clock, but if the clock was running 11 minutes slow, then the actual time of his departure was 9:11 in the evening. And if that is so, he could not possibly have ridden the distance between the Silver Star and the Hargrove property, committed the act, and disposed of himself before Deputy Reeves saw him at the Millers Creek Bridge at 9:22. The mathematics simply do not allow for it. The room erupted. Frank Bancroft pressed his back against the wall and felt the noise wash over him like a cold river, and something happened inside him in that moment that he could not have anticipated and could not have prevented. His certainty cracked, right down the middle, clean as an axe through dry timber. He had been so sure. He had staked his reputation, his badge, and his word on that alibi being wrong and on Eli Marsh being guilty. And in the space of 40 seconds, a woman he barely knew had dismantled everything he thought he knew with a pocket watch and a piece of arithmetic. He stared at Pearl Barrett as the noise surged around them both, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like he might be wrong. And underneath that humbling, terrifying feeling, quieter and more dangerous, something else was beginning to stir. Pearl Barrett had arrived in Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, 11 days before all of this, on the kind of bright and merciless September morning that made the desert look like something painted by an artist who had never actually seen the place and was working entirely from imagination. She came on the morning stage from Santa Fe, and she came alone, which was the first remarkable thing about her as far as the residents of Redemption Creek were concerned. The second remarkable thing was the leather satchel she carried, which was heavy enough to require both hands and which clinked and ticked with a sound that drew curious glances from the moment she stepped down onto the Main Street's hard-packed dirt. She was 27 years old, with dark hair that she wore pinned up under a practical wide-brimmed hat, and brown eyes that moved over the town with the kind of calm, appraising intelligence that made people feel as though they were being measured and found either adequate or wanting. She was not a beauty in the conventional and ornamental sense that the frontier seemed to demand of its women. She was something more unsettling than that. She was striking. There was a quality about her face, some combination of strong jaw and steady gaze, and the particular way she held herself as though the world owed her no apologies, and she owed it none either, that made it difficult to look away once you had started looking. Frank Bancroft had been leaning against the post outside his office when the stage came in. He was 33 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of weather-hardened frontiersman, with dark hair starting to show a thread of early gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that made up the canyon walls east of town. He had been sheriff of Redemption Creek for 4 years, and before that he had ridden with a cattle outfit out of Texas for 8 years, and before that he had grown up on a hardscrabble family homestead in Tennessee that had taught him the value of silence and hard work, and not expecting the world to be gentle with you. He watched Pearl Barrett step down from the stage and look at the town, and he noticed 2 things simultaneously. The first was the heavy satchel and its peculiar sound. The second was the expression on her face, which was not the nervous, hopeful expression he had grown accustomed to seeing on women who arrived in Redemption Creek looking for a fresh start or a husband or some combination of the two. It was the expression of a professional arriving at a job site. He pushed off from the post and walked over because it was his job to know who was coming and going, and because he was, at his core, a curious man who had learned to disguise his curiosity behind a mask of official duty. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Frank Bancroft, sheriff." Pearl Barrett looked at him with those measuring eyes and said, "Pearl Barrett, watchmaker and horologist. I believe Mr. Aldous Webb sent for me." Frank stared at her for a beat. He had known Aldous Webb, who ran the general store and fancied himself the town's foremost man of commerce and culture, had sent to Santa Fe for someone to service the town's clocks. Webb had made quite a production of it, announcing that Redemption Creek would soon have a professional timekeeper the way proper civilized towns did. Frank had expected an old man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. "Webb's store is down the left side of Main Street," he said, "past the barber." "Thank you," Pearl said, and she picked up her heavy satchel and walked away without looking back, and Frank Bancroft watched her go and felt a strange and unfamiliar pull somewhere in the region of his chest. He told himself it was the curiosity of a lawman. He was lying to himself, but he did not know that yet. Aldous Webb had summoned Pearl for a specific purpose beyond simple clock servicing, as it turned out. He had recently acquired a grandfather clock of considerable age and uncertain provenance that he wanted authenticated and restored. Webb was a man with aspirations toward respectability, and a fine antique clock in his parlor was, in his mind, a significant step toward that goal. But Pearl had come with her full set of tools and her full expertise, and by the afternoon of her first day in Redemption Creek, she had assessed not only Webb's grandfather clock, but also the tall case clock in the hotel lobby, the mantel clock in the bank manager's office, and the large wall clock in the Silver Star Saloon, all of which she had observed with the keen eye of someone who had spent the better part of a decade learning that time, as most people experienced it, was an imprecise and frequently misunderstood thing. Pearl had learned horology from her father, a Swiss immigrant named Eduard Barrett who had settled in Santa Fe in 1861 after spending years as a master watchmaker in Geneva. He had no sons, and he had seen no reason why his daughter could not learn the trade, and so Pearl had grown up with the smell of clock oil and the sound of escapements and the feel of tiny gears between her fingers. By the time her father died of fever in 1878, she was already better at the work than he had been, though she would never have said so. She had taken over his shop and expanded it, developing a reputation across the territory as the person you sent for when a clock was important and when ordinary repair would not do. She had also developed, over those years, an intimate understanding of a truth that most people found unsettling when she articulated it. Clocks lied. Not through any malice, but through the ordinary processes of aging and imprecision and environmental influence. Clocks drifted from true time with a consistency that was almost philosophical in its implications. A clock that no one checked against a reliable standard was, in Pearl's professional view, a social agreement rather than a factual measurement. People looked at the face and believed what they saw, and what they saw was always a story the clock was telling about the time, not the time itself. This understanding, this deep-grained professional skepticism about what any given clock was actually reporting, was what she was thinking about on the evening of September 3rd when she sat in the Silver Star Saloon completing her assessment of the wall clock over the bar. She sat at a corner table with her notebook and her regulator watch, the most accurate portable timepiece available in 1882, a railroad-grade precision instrument that she had purchased in New York City 2 years earlier and maintained with obsessive care. She noted that the Silver Star's wall clock was running slow. She noted the exact degree of its inaccuracy. She wrote it in her notebook as she wrote everything precisely with the date and time. She had no idea in that moment that her note in that notebook would become the instrument of a young man's salvation. She had no idea that the quiet man who came into the saloon that evening and sat at the bar nursing a whiskey was watching her with an expression that she would later recognize, in retrospect, as the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for. Frank Bancroft had come in to check the premises, as he did every other evening. He saw the watchmaker woman in the corner with her tools and her notebook, and he thought about going over to say something, and then he thought better of it, and then he sat at the bar and drank his whiskey and watched her work with the kind of attention a man pays when he is trying to convince himself he is not paying attention. Pearl Barrett packed her tools at 9:20, or so her regulator said, and left the saloon without speaking to anyone. She passed within 4 feet of the bar on her way to the door. She did not look at Frank Bancroft. He looked at her, and then she was gone out into the warm September night. He finished his whiskey and told himself to focus on his job. The murder of Thomas Hargrove was discovered on the morning of September 4th by Hargrove's hired man, a taciturn Mexican man named Rodrigo, who had arrived at the property to begin the morning's work, and found his employer dead on the floor of his study. Thomas Hargrove was 61 years old, a land speculator who had made enemies the way other men made acquaintances, with ease and regularity, and apparently without any concern for the consequences. He had been shot once cleanly, and the circumstances pointed towards someone who had known him and had been angry about something specific. Frank arrived at the scene within the hour and conducted his examination with the methodical thoroughness that had defined his law enforcement career. He was not a perfect man, but he was a careful and honest one, and he approached the question of Thomas Hargrove's killer with the same patient attention he applied to everything that mattered. He noted the entry wound, the angle, the lack of forced entry, the single overturned glass on the desk, and the open drawer that suggested Hargrove had been reaching for something, probably the small pistol that was now missing from the property. His investigation led him within 24 hours to Eli Marsh. Eli Marsh was 22 years old, the son of a widowed seamstress who lived at the edge of town, and he had a documented and publicly witnessed argument with Thomas Hargrove 2 weeks before the murder over a debt that Hargrove refused to honor, a sum of $40 that Hargrove owed Eli's mother for a winter's worth of sewing work. Eli had stood in the middle of Main Street on a Tuesday afternoon and told Thomas Hargrove in front of a dozen witnesses that there would be consequences. 2 witnesses from the Silver Star Saloon reported that Eli had been in the bar on the evening of September 3rd and had left at what they said was 9 o'clock, based on the wall clock over the bar. Hargrove's property was 2 miles out of town by the South Road. Frank's deputy, a steady man named Cal Reeves, had been at the Millers Creek Bridge on the South Road at 9:22 that evening checking on a report of cattle blocking the road, and he had seen no one pass. A man on horseback could cover 2 miles in under 10 minutes on good road in decent conditions, which meant that if Eli had left the saloon at 9 o'clock, he had 32 minutes to reach Hargrove's property, commit the murder, and return or continue south before Cal's arrival at the bridge, with the bridge representing the only viable route between town and the Hargrove property. It was tight, but Frank had worked with tighter timelines. He brought Eli in for questioning. Eli denied everything with the panicked, incoherent energy of a young man who was terrified but had nothing to hide, which Frank, in his experience, could look exactly like the energy of a young man who was terrified because he had everything to hide. He charged Eli Marsh with the murder of Thomas Hargrove and locked him in the jail pending trial. Frank was certain. He had his motive, his timeline, his witnesses. The alibi Eli offered, that he had gone home directly after leaving the saloon and that his mother could confirm his arrival, was undermined by the fact that Eli's mother lived on the South Road too, and Hargrove's property was on the way there. She had heard him come in at what she estimated was around 9:30, which by Frank's calculation was consistent with a man who had stopped along the way to do something he should not have. He was certain. He told himself he was certain. Pearl Barrett heard about the arrest on the morning of September 5th and felt the first small, cold prickle of doubt at the base of her skull. She was having breakfast at the town's single-eating establishment, a clean and competent little restaurant run by a widow named Mrs. Clara Hodge, and she was listening to the conversation at the next table with the particular quality of attention that was her habit. The habit of a woman who had learned that information was always more valuable than it appeared on the surface. Two men were discussing Eli Marsh's arrest with the comfortable certainty of people who had already decided how the story ended, and one of them mentioned that the witness testimony was based on the Silver Star's wall clock. Pearl set down her coffee cup. She thought about her notebook. She thought about the number she had written there 2 nights before. She thought about the silver railroad watch in her coat pocket and the precise and careful comparison she had made between its reading and the reading on the Silver Star's wall clock. 11 minutes. The Silver Star's clock had been running 11 minutes slow. She paid for her breakfast with the careful deliberateness of a woman making a decision, while her hands continued to perform ordinary tasks, and she walked back to the room she had taken at the hotel. And she sat on the edge of the bed with her notebook open in her lap and worked through the arithmetic 3 times to be absolutely sure. If Eli Marsh had left the Silver Star at what appeared to be 9 o'clock on the saloon's wall clock, but that clock was running 11 minutes slow, then the actual time of his departure was 9:11. And if he had left at 9:11, and Cal Reeves had been at the Millers Creek Bridge at 9:22, then Eli had exactly 11 minutes to ride 2 miles to Hargrove's property, commit a murder, and cover enough ground to be out of sight before Cal arrived at the bridge. On a good horse, a motivated rider could perhaps just manage 2 miles in 11 minutes on hard, flat road. But the South Road was not flat and it was not hard. It was rocky and winding, and it crossed 2 creek beds, and any horseman who had ridden it knew that 2 miles was closer to a 15 or 20-minute ride in ordinary conditions. The mathematics did not allow for Eli Marsh to be the killer. Pearl sat very still for a moment. Then she put her notebook in her satchel, put her satchel over her shoulder, and walked across the street to the sheriff's office. Frank Bancroft looked up from the report he was writing when the door opened, and felt the same pull in his chest that he had felt twice before in Pearl Barrett's vicinity, once when she walked away from the stage stop, once in the saloon. He suppressed it with the practiced ease of a man who had had considerable experience suppressing things that were inconvenient. "Miss Barrett," he said, "something I can help you with." She walked to his desk and placed her open notebook in front of him without preamble and said, "The Silver Star's wall clock was running 11 minutes slow on the night of the 3rd. I measured it myself against my regulator watch. These are my notes." Frank looked at the notebook. The handwriting was precise and neat, the numbers clear and carefully notated with dates and times. He looked up at her. "I appreciate your interest," he said, keeping his voice neutral, "but I have 2 witnesses who confirm Eli Marsh's departure time from the saloon." "They confirmed what the clock showed," Pearl said. not the actual time. There is a significant difference, Sheriff. The clock on the wall is how people tell time, Frank said, and he heard a slight edge creep into his voice that he had not intended and that he recognized as the defensive sound of certainty beginning to feel threatened. Pearl did not react to the edge. A clock on the wall is a measuring instrument, she said, and like any measuring instrument, it must be calibrated regularly against a known standard to be accurate. The Silver Star's clock had not been serviced in at least 3 years based on the condition of its movement. I found significant wear on the mainspring and fouling in the escapement that would have caused exactly this degree of slowing. The clock was wrong, Sheriff Bancroft, not by a little, by 11 minutes. And in this case, 11 minutes is the difference between guilt and innocence. Frank looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching or looking away or performing any of the small social gestures that most people defaulted to when a man in authority looked at them steadily and did not immediately agree with them. She just looked back, steady and certain, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was not trying to convince him of anything. She was simply reporting a fact, and whether he accepted it or not was, in her view, a matter of his own intelligence and integrity. It was, he would realize later, one of the most affecting things he had ever experienced. "How precise is your watch?" he asked. "It is a railroad chronometer, made by the Hamilton Watch Company and certified to an accuracy of 30 seconds per day. I synchronize it weekly against the time ball at the Santa Fe railway station when I am in the city, and I have a portable time ball kit that allows me to check it against astronomical time when I am in the field." She reached into her coat pocket and placed the watch on his desk beside the notebook. It was a serious, beautiful instrument, substantial and precise, its case engraved with the maker's mark. "I have documentation of its last certification if you require it." Frank looked at the watch. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Pearl Barrett's face, which was calm and intelligent, and entirely without the pleading quality that he might have expected from someone asking him to reconsider a decision he had made publicly and with confidence. He said, "Why didn't you come to me immediately when you heard about the arrest?" Something shifted in her expression then, just briefly, a flicker of something that might have been a recognition that this was the right question. "I did come immediately," she said. "I heard this morning and I came this morning. But also, Sheriff, I needed to be certain. I checked my arithmetic 3 times before I came. I do not bring imprecise information to serious situations." Frank looked at her for another long moment and then looked back down at the notebook, and he spent 2 full minutes reading her notes with the careful attention they deserved. And in those 2 minutes, he felt the structure of his certainty develop cracks that he could not ignore. "I'll need to look into this," he said finally. "I expect you will," Pearl said, and she picked up her watch and put it back in her pocket with the efficient grace of someone who had never doubted for a moment that she would be leaving with it, and she walked out of his office. Frank sat very still for a while after she left. Then he got up and walked to the Silver Star saloon and looked at the clock on the south wall for a long time, and then he pulled out his own watch and compared it, and felt the cold settling weight of a man who is beginning to understand that he has made a very serious mistake. His own watch, a perfectly ordinary stem-wound pocket watch that he had never had certified against anything, showed a time that was 4 minutes different from the saloon clock. He could not tell, from that observation alone, which one was right, but he could tell that they disagreed, and Pearl Barrett's documentation was sitting in her notebook like a quiet and devastating argument. He went home that night and did not sleep well. The next 3 days were the most intellectually and emotionally turbulent of Frank Bancroft's professional life, and they were also, though he would not have been able to articulate this at the time, the most significant days of his personal life. He consulted with Pearl Barrett 3 more times in those days, each time under the official guise of investigating her claim, and each time he found himself less concerned with the official purpose of the visit and more absorbed in the quality of her mind. She was systematic in a way that was almost beautiful to watch. She had, without being asked, documented the clock's condition with written descriptions and detailed diagrams, cross-referenced her regulator watch readings against the time she had noted from the hotel lobby clock and the bank clock to establish a baseline, and written a clear and logical argument that a court could follow. She had done all of this because it was what the situation required, not because anyone had asked her to, and not because she had anything to gain from it. Eli Marsh was a virtual stranger to her. She had seen him perhaps twice in passing, but she had the information, and Eli Marsh needed the information, and that was sufficient reason. "You do understand," Frank said on the second evening, sitting across the small table in the hotel's front parlor from Pearl, who was showing him the diagram she had made of the clock's internal mechanism, "that if you're right about this, it doesn't just mean Marsh is innocent. It means whoever actually killed Hargrove is still out there." Pearl looked up from the diagrams. "I'm aware," she said. "Does that concern you more than convicting an innocent man concerns you?" It was not a challenge exactly. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness that he had come to understand was simply how she operated. She was not performing directness for effect. She was incapable of the kind of elaborate social indirection that most people practiced as a matter of course, not out of ignorance but out of a deep-seated conviction that honesty was more efficient. "No," Frank said. "It doesn't." She nodded, as if he had answered correctly. Then she said, "Then I think you should look more carefully at who else had reason to want Thomas Hargrove dead." He already was. He had been going through his notes on Hargrove with new eyes since the afternoon he had stood in the Silver Star, and felt his certainty developing its first serious fractures. Hargrove had been, as Frank had known all along, a man who specialized in enemies. There was the matter of the disputed land claim with his neighbor, a man named Gerald Prout, who had been engaged in a boundary dispute with Hargrove for 2 years over a strip of creekside property that both men considered essential to their operations. There was the Santa Fe Land Investment Company that Hargrove had reportedly defrauded out of a significant sum, with the kind of complicated paperwork-level manipulation that was difficult to prosecute, but generated real and lasting hatred. There was the former business partner, a man named Wade Culver, who had parted ways with Hargrove under circumstances that Culver described as theft and Hargrove had described as legitimate business. Frank had not pursued any of these leads as aggressively as he should have because he had been certain about Eli Marsh. On the third day, he made a decision. He went to Judge Poole and requested a hearing rather than proceeding directly to trial, citing new evidence that required examination before the matter could be properly adjudicated. Poole, a careful man who feared reversible error more than almost anything, agreed. That was the hearing where Pearl Barrett had said the words that stopped Frank's heart. The courtroom eruption lasted approximately 3 minutes before Judge Poole restored order with the combination of gavel and voice that had made him effective on the frontier bench for 2 decades. He looked at Pearl Barrett with the expression of a man reassessing his initial impression and finding it significantly upgraded. "Miss Barrett," he said, "are you prepared to submit your documentation to this court?" "Yes, Your Honor," Pearl said. "And are you prepared to be cross-examined on your methodology and conclusions?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then the court will recognize you as an expert witness on the matter of horology and the accuracy of the relevant timepiece, and your testimony will be entered into the formal record. Do you understand what that means?" "It means I am testifying under oath and that my words have legal standing," Pearl said. "I understand perfectly." Harlan Poole almost smiled. "Counsel for the prosecution," he said, looking at the town's sole attorney, a nervous man named Abner Fitch who had built his entire case on the saloon clock and was visibly reconsidering his career choices. "You will have the opportunity to challenge Miss Barrett's testimony. Proceed when you are ready." Abner Fitch proceeded. He questioned Pearl for 45 minutes with every technique of challenge and discrediting he possessed, which was not insignificant, And at the end of those 45 minutes, Pearl Barrett's testimony stood exactly as solid as it had when she had first delivered it, because it was based on documented, reproducible measurements and sound arithmetic and the kind of professional expertise that could not be shaken by questions about her credentials or her motivations or her personal interest in the case. Frank watched from his position against the back wall and felt something he could not entirely contain or categorize. It was not simply admiration, though it was certainly that. It was something larger and more personal. He had spent 4 years as sheriff of Redemption Creek, being the person who had the answers, the person whose certainty anchored the community's sense of safety and order. He was comfortable in that role. He had earned it. And here was a woman who had arrived in his town 11 days ago with a heavy satchel and a railroad watch. And she had been more right than he had been, not through luck or accident but through precise and disciplined expertise. And she had pursued the truth with a courage and directness that he recognized as the rarest and most valuable qualities a person could possess. He realized, standing against the back wall of a courtroom, being completely and thoroughly amazed by Pearl Barrett, and the amazement was doing something interesting to the pull he had been feeling in his chest since the morning she stepped off the stage. It was becoming something clearer, something that had a name. Judge Poole ruled that sufficient doubt existed about the timeline to justify releasing Eli Marsh on his own recognizance, pending a full reinvestigation of the case, with the explicit requirement that the reinvestigation include a formal assessment of the Silver Star's clock accuracy by the expert witness who had already provided testimony on the matter. Eli Marsh walked out of the defendant's chair with tears running down his face and went directly to his mother, who was sitting in the public gallery, and who made a sound when her son reached her that Frank heard from across the room, and which settled somewhere in him with considerable weight. He had almost hanged an innocent man. The knowledge of that sat in him like a stone. Frank caught up with Pearl on the courthouse steps as the crowd was dispersing, the townspeople talking rapidly and excitedly in the way that crowds did when something unexpected had happened, and everyone was in the process of deciding what to think about it. He said her name and she stopped and turned, and he looked at her in the afternoon light and said the only honest thing he had available to him. "You were right." Pearl looked at him steadily. "The clock was right," she said. "Or rather, it was wrong in precisely the way I said it was, which in this context amounts to the same thing." "You know what I mean," he said. A small pause. Something in her expression shifted very slightly, and he had the impression she was deciding something. "I do know what you mean," she said. "I want you to know," he said, choosing his words carefully, "that I don't take lightly what you did today, the work you put into it. The way you held up under Fitch's cross-examination, that took something. It took documentation and arithmetic," Pearl said, but there was something different in her voice now, something that was not quite the professional detachment she generally deployed. "It took courage," Frank said. "I'm not the easiest man to challenge in this town." "I noticed," she said, a beat of something between them that was warmer and more complicated than either of their previous exchanges. Then Frank said, "I owe you a dinner. Or a coffee. Or something that acknowledges that you just saved a young man's life and corrected a significant mistake on my part." Pearl looked at him for a moment with those measuring eyes, and this time the measurement seemed to be of a different and more personal kind than the professional assessment she usually applied. Then she said, "Coffee would be acceptable." Frank Bancroft felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for the better part of 4 days, and also something new begin that was going to be complicated and wonderful and worth every moment of the complication. "Mrs. Hodges' restaurant does the best coffee in the territory," he said. "I know," Pearl said. "I've been eating there every morning." He fell into step beside her on the courthouse steps, and the afternoon light lay gold and warm across the town, and Redemption Creek felt in that moment like a place where things could be made right. They had coffee that evening and talked for 3 hours, and Frank was not entirely prepared for what 3 hours of conversation with Pearl Barrett was like. He had talked with intelligent women before. He had known capable women. But Pearl had the quality of a person whose interior life was as carefully organized and deeply considered as her professional work. And conversation with her was like being handed a map of a country you had not known existed and finding that you wanted to explore every inch of it. She told him about her father, about learning to work with clocks as a child, about the precise and almost meditative quality of watchmaking, the way you could lose yourself entirely in the intricate and perfect logic of a well-made movement. She told him about building her business in Santa Fe, about the particular challenges of being a woman in a trade that people did not naturally associate with women, about the combination of excellence and patience that had eventually built her a reputation that transcended the question of her gender. "People come around to competence," she said, turning her coffee cup in her hands with an absent, thoughtful gesture that Frank found inexplicably compelling. "It takes longer than it should, and it is more exhausting than it should be, but eventually the work speaks loudly enough that the other conversation becomes irrelevant." "That's an impressive philosophy," Frank said. "It's a practical necessity," she said, with a slight smile that was the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her, and that hit him somewhere in the chest with a force entirely disproportionate to its size. He told her about Texas, about the cattle drives, the particular freedom and loneliness of riding the long trails, the way the land out there was so vast and empty that a man could feel both deeply insignificant and oddly free at the same time. He told her about coming to New Mexico territory and taking the sheriff's job and finding, to his surprise, that he was good at it, and that it satisfied something in him that the cattle work had never quite touched. "You like being the person that other people rely on," Pearl said, not as an accusation, simply as an observation. "I suppose I do," he said. "That's not a flaw," she said, "unless it becomes indistinguishable from being the person who can't tolerate being wrong." Frank looked at her across the table and felt the particular discomfort of being seen clearly by someone you have only just met and have not yet had the chance to construct your usual defenses against. "Is that what you think happened with Marsh?" he asked. She considered this honestly, which he appreciated. "I think you had a case that fit together in a way that felt solid, and you trusted your own reading of it without asking whether there were variables you had not measured," she said. "That's human. But yes, I also think that being the person the town trusts probably makes it harder to say you are not sure." "It does," he said quietly. "For what it's worth," Pearl said, and she looked at him directly, "you came around. When the evidence was put in front of you, you looked at it honestly. That matters more than getting it right the first time." Frank looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had arrived 11 days ago with her heavy satchel and her railroad watch and her entirely self-sufficient, entirely formidable self, and felt something settle in him alongside everything else, alongside the discomfort and the attraction and the surprise. Something like gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing it to me instead of going straight to the judge. I came to you first because you are the law in this town and it was the correct procedural path," she said. Then, after a pause, "and also because I thought you were someone who would listen if I could demonstrate the case clearly enough." "You thought right," he said. The small smile again. He stored it away like something he intended to look at again. The reinvestigation of Thomas Hargrove's murder moved forward over the following week, with Frank pursuing the leads he had set aside in his initial certainty about Eli Marsh. He interviewed Gerald Prout, the neighbor with the land dispute, and found the man credible and documented in his account of his whereabouts on the evening of September 3rd. He looked into the Santa Fe Land Company and found the situation more complex than simple fraud, the kind of business complexity that generated resentment but rarely direct violence. It was the former business partner, Wade Culver, who broke. Frank found Culver in the town of Las Palomas, 20 miles south of Redemption Creek, and brought him back for questioning with the steady, patient, inexorable quality that defined his interviewing technique. Culver was a man with a secret that had been pressing against the inside of his chest for 2 weeks, and Frank had learned long ago that such men, when you sat across from them in a quiet room and looked at them without anger or urgency, but simply with the calm certainty that you had all the time in the world, would eventually let the secret out. Culver had killed Hargrove over a debt of $600 and a forged deed to a silver claim that Hargrove had sold him for real money, and that turned out to be worthless paper. He had gone to the Hargrove property at 8:45 on the evening of September 3rd, before Eli Marsh had even left the Silver Star, and he had been gone well before 9 o'clock. He had not needed to cross Miller's Creek Bridge. He had taken the North Road home. The arrest of Wade Culver was straightforward and evidentially solid, and required no revision. Eli Marsh, free and unharmed, came to Frank's office on the day after Culver's arrest and shook his hand for a long time without speaking, and Frank accepted the handshake with the sober awareness of what had been at stake. Then Eli Marsh went to Pearl Barrett's hotel room and knocked on the door and thanked her, and she accepted his thanks with a warmth that Frank, passing in the street below, caught a glimpse of through the open window and added to his growing collection of observations about her. He found himself, that evening, standing outside the hotel wondering whether he had any legitimate reason to go in and speak with her, and acknowledging that he did not, and going in anyway. She was in the small parlor reading, a book on astronomical navigation that she had apparently brought with her from Santa Fe, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that carried, he thought, a degree of warmth that had not been there on the first day. "Culver confessed," he said. "I heard," she said. She set down her book. "How are you?" The question surprised him, not the question itself, which was ordinary enough, but the quality of it. She was asking a real question, not a social formality. "Relieved," he said honestly, "and uncomfortable. Both seem appropriate," she said. "Come and sit down." He came and sat down in the chair across from her, and they talked again, and this time the conversation had a different quality, easier and more personal. The conversation of two people who have moved past the introduction and are beginning to understand that they are in territory neither of them had quite expected to enter. He asked her how long she intended to stay in Redemption Creek. She said she had completed her work for Aldous Webb and that her business in Santa Fe would soon require her return. He felt something that he recognized immediately as disappointment and did not try to disguise it, at least not from himself. "Is there other work here that might keep you longer?" He asked, and he heard the intent in the question and knew she heard it too. She looked at him with those steady, measuring eyes and said, "What kind of work did you have in mind, Sheriff Bancroft?" "The hotel clock is unreliable," he said, "and the church has a bell mechanism that I'm told has been running erratically for 2 years, and the bank manager has been complaining about his mantel clock since spring." Pearl looked at him for a moment and then said, "Those are legitimate professional concerns." "They are," he said, "and you are asking me to address them." "I am," he said, "in an official capacity. The town has resources for professional services." "In an official capacity," Pearl repeated, and there was a slight warmth in her voice now that made the repetition feel like something more than confirmation. "And also," Frank said, and he stopped, and he looked at her across the parlor in the lamplight, and he was a man who had spent his adult life being plain and direct, and he saw no reason to change that now. "I would like to have more evenings like the last 2, if you are willing." The silence that followed was brief and complete and entirely comfortable. Pearl looked at him with an expression he was beginning to learn, the expression of a person who is thinking honestly about something rather than performing the social ritual of thinking. "I am willing," she said. The weeks that followed were among the strangest and most quietly significant of Frank Bancroft's life. Strange because nothing dramatic was happening. The work of law enforcement in Redemption Creek returned to its ordinary rhythms. The minor disputes and occasional thefts and regular drunken disorderly situations that comprised the daily texture of his job. Pearl worked her way through the town's clocks with methodical care, adjusting and certifying each one, and leaving behind her a town where time was, for the first time in years, actually accurate. She and Frank developed a habit of evening coffee that became dinner, and then, some evenings, long walks along the edge of town where the land opened up into the wide, dark sweep of the desert, and the stars came out in a quantity and brilliance that the settled East never achieved. She told him things about time, the real physics of it, the way a pendulum's period varied with altitude and temperature, the way early railroad schedules had revealed that different towns operated on slightly different local times based on the position of the sun, how the railroads had eventually had to impose a standardized time on the whole country to make schedules possible. She described the great observatories where astronomers tracked the stars and transmitted time signals by telegraph. She made the subject feel like a kind of philosophy, a window into the nature of reality. He listened. He had learned, very early in his acquaintance with Pearl Barrett, that listening to her was never passive. She required a certain quality of attention, not deference, not performance, but genuine engagement. She noticed when you were following and when you were not, and she calibrated her conversation accordingly, and the result was that talking with her was the most stimulating intellectual experience he had ever had. He told her things he had not told most people. About the years in Texas, which had been freer and lonelier than he usually admitted. About the reason he had taken the sheriff's job, which was not only about being good at it, but about a deep-seated need to belong somewhere, to be part of a place in a way that a hired rider was not. He told her about his family in Tennessee, his parents who had worked the land with a patient, uncomplaining steadiness that he admired more now than he had as a boy. He told her about the closest he had ever come to being killed, a knife fight behind a saloon in Abilene in 1874 that he had survived by a margin of less than an inch. She listened with the same quality of attention she required from him, and he realized over those weeks that there was a particular feeling he had never experienced quite so purely before, the feeling of being genuinely known by another person. Not known through reputation or role, not the way his deputies or the townspeople knew him as the sheriff, but known as himself, as Frank Bancroft specifically, the man behind the badge. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. In mid-October, on an evening when the air had the first real bite of autumn in it, and they were walking the east edge of town with the canyon walls dark and distant to the east, Frank stopped walking and Pearl stopped beside him, and he turned to face her in the last light of the day and said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want to ask it clearly so there is no confusion about what I mean." Pearl turned to face him. The evening light made her face extraordinary. "All right," she said. "I know you have a business in Santa Fe," he said. "I know your work takes you across the territory. I know you are not the kind of woman who would be satisfied with the ordinary shape of a frontier life, keeping a house and waiting for a man to come home." He held her gaze because looking away would have felt dishonest. "I'm asking whether any of that leaves room for something between us, not because I expect you to change your life, but because if there is room, I would very much like to occupy it." The silence that followed was brief. Pearl looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something open and unguarded in a way that was different from her usual steady directness. She looked for a moment like a person who had not quite expected to feel what she was feeling. "That," she said slowly, "is either the most respectful or the most calculated thing a man has ever said to me." "It's respectful," he said, "and it's honest, and it is the furthest thing from calculated I've ever managed." Pearl looked at him for a long moment in the autumn evening, and then she did something that surprised him completely. She stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw, her watchmaker's fingers precise and warm against his face, and she said, "There is room, Frank Bancroft. There has been room for some time now." He kissed her in the last light of the day, with the canyon walls dark behind him, and the stars beginning to appear overhead, and the warm weight of her hand still against his jaw, and it felt like the most precise and accurate thing he had ever done. Their courtship was, like Pearl herself, unconventional and deeply serious, and entirely without the performative elements that most frontier courtships relied upon. There were no formal calls with chaperones or rehearsed declarations on bended knees. There were evenings of genuine conversation and shared work, and the gradual, building intimacy of two people who had both been, in their different ways, alone for a long time and were discovering that the aloneness was negotiable. Frank helped Pearl with the heavy clock cases when the work required it. Pearl helped Frank understand, with increasing clarity and precision, why his instincts about people and situations were often excellent, but his tendency to commit too quickly to a conclusion was a liability that good investigative work required him to address. They argued, occasionally and productively, about matters of both general and specific importance. Pearl did not yield to him simply because he was the man or the authority. Frank did not dismiss her simply because she was challenging him. They arrived, over those weeks, at a quality of mutual respect that was the foundation of something real. In late October, Pearl told him she needed to return to Santa Fe to attend to her business, that she had now been away nearly 2 months, and that correspondence from her shop assistant indicated several matters requiring her direct attention. She would be gone, she estimated, 3 to 4 weeks. Frank felt the announcement land in him with a weight that surprised him, which was not to say that it surprised him that he would miss her, but that the degree and specificity of the feeling was something new. He had missed the cattle drives when he had left them, but that was a general missing. This was a particular and exact absence, the particular absence of Pearl Barrett specifically, and it was already uncomfortable before she had even left. "I'll be back," she said, reading something in his face that he had not fully expressed. "My business is in Santa Fe. My work brings me across the territory regularly, and Redemption Creek has clocks that still need attention." "It does," he said. And she said, and the warmth in her voice was unambiguous now, as clear and clean as a note struck on a well-tuned instrument. "I find that I want to come back." "Then come back," he said. She did. Pearl returned in late November, and the shape of things between them had not diminished in her absence but had instead clarified, the way a clock movement that has been cleaned and oiled settles into its proper function, with a precision it could not achieve before. Frank met the stage with a composure that he was inwardly extremely grateful for, because what he felt when he saw her step down from the coach in her practical coat with her heavy satchel over one shoulder was not composed at all. They did not embrace on the street. That was not the way of either of them, and it was not, in any case, consistent with the small-town social dynamics of 1882 New Mexico territory that Pearl navigated with the same practical intelligence she applied to everything. But she met his eyes, and he met hers, and there was, in that moment, a completeness of communication that required no physical expression to be entirely clear. He invited her to dinner that evening at Mrs. Hodges', and she came, and he had thought carefully about what he wanted to say, and he said it over the soup with the directness she had always shown him, and that he had, under her influence, been working to improve in himself. "I'd like to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want to say clearly that I'm not asking because I think it will change what you do or where you go or who you are. I'm asking because I want to be your husband and I want us to be each other's people in whatever shape that takes." Pearl looked at him across the table for a long moment. Then she said, "You've been thinking about how to say that." "I have," he admitted. "I wanted to get it right." "You did," she said. And then in the same plain and direct voice she used for everything that mattered, "Yes, Frank, I will marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand, her watchmaker's hand, precise and capable and warm in his, and he held it while Mrs. Hodge arrived with the second course, and pretended not to notice with the particular grace of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this development for several weeks. They were married in Redemption Creek in the first week of January 1883, in the town's small church, with the bell mechanism that Pearl had repaired in October, and that rang clearly and accurately as they emerged from the ceremony into a bright winter morning. Judge Harlan Poole, who had presided over Eli Marsh's hearing, and who had developed a pronounced personal respect for Pearl in the months since, performed the ceremony with a dignity that touched Frank considerably. Eli Marsh was there with his mother, and he looked at both of them with an expression that contained everything that the moment had meant to him. Aldous Webb was there, pleased with himself for having brought Pearl to Redemption Creek in the first place, and not shy about expressing it. Cal Reeves, Frank's deputy, who had known Frank for 3 years and had never seen him look the way he looked on that January morning, stood as best man, and managed to hold himself together until the reception at Mrs. Hodges', where he had a glass of whiskey and told Pearl with complete sincerity that he had never seen his boss this happy, and that it was an improvement. Pearl, who had arranged for her shop assistant in Santa Fe to manage the business with an expanded budget and authority during her extended absences, had made a practical series of decisions about the shape of their married life that she and Frank had worked out together over the weeks before the wedding, with the kind of collaborative intelligence that Frank was already understanding was one of the most distinctive qualities of his partnership with Pearl. She would maintain her business in Santa Fe. She would travel for work when necessary. She would return to Redemption Creek when she could, and she would make Redemption Creek her primary base of operations because the town was, she had admitted, more interesting than she had expected, partly because of the clocks and partly because of its sheriff. Frank would remain the sheriff, which was his work and his vocation, and the thing he was built to do. He would build them a proper house, larger and better than his existing bachelor quarters, which Pearl had assessed with the same professional calm she applied to clocks and found adequate for immediate purposes but requiring significant expansion. They built the house over the spring. Frank worked on it himself on his days off, alongside a carpenter named Martinez, who was the best builder in the county, and Pearl came home from a trip to Santa Fe in April to find the frame up and the roof beginning to take shape, and felt something move through her that she had not expected. It was the first structure she had ever had a hand in building in any way, a permanence, a declaration in timber and stone that she was, for the first time in her adult life, building something in a place rather than simply passing through it. She stood in the doorway of the frameless house with the sky showing through the roof beams, and Frank stood beside her, and she took his hand with a naturalness that had become, over the months, entirely unconsidered. She just took it, the way she would pick up a tool that belonged in her hand. "It's going to be good," she said. "It's going to be very good," he said. Spring moved into summer and summer into another fall, and the rhythms of their life together took shape with the organic, incremental character of genuine things. Pearl traveled and worked and came home with new stories from new places and the occasional extraordinary timepiece that she had acquired or repaired somewhere on the road, which she would set up in the house, and which would add their particular voices to the domestic soundscape she was building. Their house was, it turned out, full of the sound of well-maintained clocks, a sound that Frank, who had spent his entire adult life in silence of one kind or another, found unexpectedly comforting. He had made his own adjustments. He had worked, with considerable discipline and Pearl's frank assistance, on the tendency to overcommit to a conclusion before all the evidence was in. He had instituted a practice of identifying, in any significant investigation, the variables he had not yet measured, a phrase Pearl used professionally, and that had lodged itself in his thinking with permanent effect. He was a better lawman for it. He was more honest about it than most men would have been, because Pearl's directness was contagious, and he had been willingly infected. The matter of the Hargrove murder was fully settled by July of 1883, when Wade Culver was tried and convicted and sentenced to a term in the territorial prison. The evidence at trial included Pearl's testimony about the Silver Stars clock, which established definitively that Eli Marsh had been nowhere near the crime at the relevant time, and Wade Culver's confession, and the documentary evidence of the fraudulent silver claim deed. It was a clean and thorough conviction, the kind of outcome that Frank had been proud to have been part of delivering, even though the path to it had required him to acknowledge a significant earlier failure. He acknowledged the failure, publicly and clearly, in his testimony at Culver's trial. He said that he had arrested Eli Marsh on the basis of a timeline that assumed the accuracy of a clock he should have verified, and that the correction of that assumption by Pearl Barrett, whose testimony he would recommend to this court in the strongest possible terms, had been essential to arriving at the truth. He said it plainly, without defensiveness, and the courtroom was quiet in a way that Judge Poole noted later as the kind of silence that meant something important had been heard. Eli Marsh's mother, sitting in the same gallery where she had wept at her son's hearing, pressed her hands together when Frank said it and looked at the floor and breathed very carefully. After the trial, Frank and Pearl walked home through the late July afternoon, and Frank was quiet and Pearl walked beside him and let the quiet be what it needed to be. She had learned his silences over the past year. This one was not troubled. It was the silence of a man settling something. "All right?" she asked after a while. "All right," he said, and then after another moment, "Better than all right, actually." She looked at him. "I made a mistake that nearly cost a young man his life," he said, "and I corrected it, and the real killer is in prison, and the town's clocks are accurate, and I'm walking home with my wife." He glanced at her with the slight, understated warmth that was his equivalent of another man's elaborate declaration. "It seems like the balance is good." Pearl thought about this with the honest, careful consideration she gave to everything. Then she said, "The balance is very good." He took her hand on the main street of Redemption Creek in the July afternoon, with the sun high and bright, and the town going about its ordinary business around them, and they walked home together through the sound and heat and life of the place they had made. In the autumn of 1883, Pearl told Frank she was expecting their first child. She told him over breakfast on a Tuesday morning in September, a year almost to the day from when she had first stepped off the stage in Redemption Creek, with the same directness she applied to everything, looking at him across the table with the steady, warm expression that was the most personal version of herself she had. He looked at her for a moment, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and pulled her gently to her feet and held her in the kitchen of their house for a long time without speaking, and she let him. And outside the windows the September morning was bright and still, and somewhere in the house a clock ticked with the steady, precise rhythm of time being kept honestly. When he let her go he looked at her face, and he was not, he discovered, capable of composing himself. He was simply, completely, and entirely happy in the uncomplicated and unguarded way that life reserves for its very best moments. "You're not going to say anything smart and calm," Pearl observed. "I am not," he agreed. She smiled, the full, warm, unguarded smile that he had been collecting since the first one, and which never got less significant. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, in the house Frank had built and Pearl had made into a home, attended by the town's doctor and Mrs. Hodge, who had appointed herself an indispensable presence at the event, and who was not wrong about her indispensability. He was healthy and strong, and Pearl, who had gone through labor with the same determined focus she brought to difficult work, held him afterward with an expression on her face that was unlike any Frank had seen there before, something entirely new in its quality, something deep and certain and fundamentally changed. Frank held his son and felt the world rearrange itself. They named him James Edward Bancroft. James, because it was Frank's father's name, and Edward because it was Pearl's father's name. A link in both directions, into the past and toward the future, as honest a gesture as either of them knew how to make. James Edward grew with the particular quality of children born to parents who take knowledge seriously, an insatiable curiosity that expressed itself from the moment he was old enough to have preferences, in questions about everything, about the clocks that lined the shelves of his mother's workshop, about the horses in the stable behind the house, about the stars, about the badge his father wore and what it meant. Pearl spent the months of her early motherhood managing her business through correspondence and shorter trips than she had made before, with the practical acknowledgement that the shape of her work life was necessarily shifting, not ending, shifting, which was different. Frank took on more of the domestic management of things than either his upbringing or his community's expectations had quite prepared him for, and he found, to his own surprise, that he was entirely willing. He cooked a passable meal. He was a patient and attentive presence with his son. He did these things not because they had been required of him, but because they were required by the reality of his family, and because Pearl had built in him, over the past year, a more honest relationship with reality than he had previously maintained. She came home from a week's work in Santa Fe when James was 8 months old to find Frank in the kitchen with the baby on his arm and a biscuit disaster on the table, and she stood in the doorway and laughed, really laughed, with the full and unself-conscious sound that she rarely made. And Frank looked at her from across the kitchen with the baby on his arm and the biscuit disaster on the table, and felt something that was so far beyond contentment that he did not have a word for it. The years passed with the accumulating richness of a life that is being lived honestly and with intention. Redemption Creek grew, as the towns of the New Mexico Territory were growing in the 1880s, with new families and new businesses, and the gradual establishment of the kind of civic permanence that made a settlement into a community. Pearl's clocks became known throughout the region. She serviced timepieces from as far as Albuquerque and Las Cruces, and her reputation as the most accurate and technically skilled horologist in the territory was uncontested. She hired an apprentice in 1885, a young woman named Rosario, who had come to Santa Fe from Mexico City with a mathematical education and hands that turned out to be perfectly suited to the precision work. Frank was re-elected sheriff by large margins in 1884 and again in 1886, and he had developed, over those years, a quality of leadership that went beyond the simple exercise of authority. He had become the kind of lawman who was trusted not because he was powerful but because he was fair, which was rarer than it should have been. He had developed, under Pearl's influence, the habit of asking himself, in any complicated situation, whether there were variables he had not yet measured. It was a professional practice that had saved him from at least 2 significant errors that he could identify, and probably several he could not. He had also, over those years, built something that he thought of privately as a philosophy of justice that was more nuanced and more honest than the simple application of law. It acknowledged, for instance, the systematic unfairness of how the territory treated its Mexican residents, how Rodrigo, who had found Hargrove's body and reported it, had been questioned with a suspicion that had no basis in fact and every basis in prejudice. It acknowledged that the law, as written and as applied, was not always the same thing as justice, and that a man who wore a badge had an obligation to pursue the better of those 2 things when they diverged. This was not a comfortable philosophy in 1886 New Mexico Territory, and it generated friction occasionally. But Frank Bancroft had, by then, a wife who had built her professional life on the principle that accurate measurement was more important than comfortable agreement, and her influence on his thinking ran deep. In 1886, Pearl was appointed, through the intercession of 2 Santa Fe Railway executives who had encountered her work and been impressed by it, as the official horological consultant for the Santa Fe Railway's New Mexico division. The appointment came with a salary that was larger than Frank's, a circumstance that was commented upon by a few of the town's less thoughtful residents, and that neither Frank nor Pearl found remotely significant. Time was Pearl's domain. Money was a measurement of value, and Pearl's work was valuable. The arithmetic was simple. She celebrated the appointment by buying herself an extraordinary marine chronometer that had been made in London, and that arrived in a mahogany case lined with green velvet. And she set it up in her workshop, and recalibrated everything in her collection against it, and went over the whole house with the satisfied expression of a person whose tools are now exactly right. James turned too and began to walk, and then to run with the headlong commitment of a child who has decided that stillness is for other people. He was dark-haired like his mother and had Frank's gray eyes, and the particular expression of a person thinking about three things simultaneously that he had, apparently, acquired from both parents equally. Pearl discovered in the early months of 1887 that she was pregnant again. She told Frank with the same directness she had used the first time, over breakfast, on a Tuesday morning, because Pearl Barrett did not change her methods simply because she had used them before. Frank got up and came around the table and held her, and Pearl held him back, and neither of them needed to say anything, because they had built, over 4 years of marriage, a language between them that was more accurate than words. Their second child was a girl, born in the autumn of 1887. They named her Clara after Mrs. Hodge, who had been the most reliable and generous presence in their domestic life, and who wept in a dignified fashion when she was told, and then went, and made the finest meal she had ever produced to celebrate. Clara from her first days was a different kind of person from her brother, quieter and more watchful, with her mother's steady, assessing gaze delivered from a face that looked astonishingly like Frank's. She was, as she grew, possessed of an interest in the natural world that expressed itself in the careful collection of specimens and the intense observation of the life that happened around her. And Pearl, who recognized the scientific instinct for observation when she saw it, began very early to nurture it. James, meanwhile, had determined that horses were the most important thing in the world, and spent as much time as his parents permitted at the livery stable and the corral behind the house, and had by the age of 4 developed a relationship with Frank's horse, a steady roan named Copper, that Frank watched with a complicated mixture of paternal pride and mild professional jealousy. By 1889, New Mexico Territory was changing rapidly, with the settlement pressure of new arrivals from the east, and the ongoing and often painful consolidation of land and resources that marked this period in the territory's history. Frank found his work increasingly involved in the complex, often injustice-laden disputes that arose when new and old claims collided, when families who had farmed the land for generations found themselves caught between legal frameworks that had been written without their interests in mind. He navigated these situations with the care of a man who understood that the law was a tool, and that tools could be used well or poorly, and that using them well required knowing not just their specifications but their limitations. Pearl, who was traveling the railway lines regularly by now and encountering these dynamics in town after town, had a great deal to say about all of it on the evenings she was home, and Frank listened with the deep attentiveness he had brought to every conversation with her since the first one. They argued sometimes, about the specific and about the general, about what was possible within the law and what required working outside it, about what obligations a person in authority had toward people the authority was structured to disadvantage, about the competing claims of individual justice and social order. These were not easy conversations, and they were not always resolved, but they were honest, and honest conversation, Frank had come to believe, was the foundation of everything that mattered. On a June evening in 1889, sitting on the porch of their house with the children in bed and the summer dark full of stars, Pearl said to him, "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" "This. Here." She gestured, a small, precise gesture that somehow encompassed the house, the town, the life. "You could have been anywhere. You're good at what you do. You could have gone to a larger city, a more significant position." Frank was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. Then he said, The night I watched you in the Silver Star with your notebook and your watch working alone in that corner, I thought you were the most complete person I had ever seen. Like you had everything you needed inside yourself and the work was simply the expression of it. Pearl looked at him. I think about that sometimes, he said, when I wonder whether what I've built here is enough. And then I think about what I have with you and with James and Clara, and the answer is always the same. Which is? That enough is a very small word for something this large, he said. Pearl looked at him in the starlight for a long moment, and then she leaned over and put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they sat in the June night with the town quiet around them and the stars indifferent and brilliant overhead, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else was required. In the autumn of 1889, the town of Redemption Creek reached a moment of civic significance when the territorial government proposed the installation of a standardized public clock tower. The project was part of a broader effort to bring uniform timekeeping to the growing towns of New Mexico in advance of anticipated statehood, and the proposal generated considerable excitement in a community that had come, over the past 7 years, to have an unusually sophisticated understanding of why timekeeping mattered. The project committee appointed Pearl Barrett as its technical director without any dissent, which was itself a measure of how thoroughly she had become a part of the place and how completely her expertise had been absorbed into the town's sense of itself. Pearl designed the mechanism with meticulous care, working with a clockmaker in Denver and the Hamilton Watch Company representative who traveled out from Indiana to consult. She specified the movement, the escapement, the pendulum, the bell mechanism, and the maintenance schedule with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. She wrote a maintenance manual for whoever would be responsible for the clock in the years to come, and insisted that the document be permanently housed in the town hall's official records. The clock tower was completed and inaugurated in November 1889, and the inauguration was, in the understated way of Redemption Creek, a genuine civic event. The whole town turned out, and Judge Poole gave a speech, and Aldous Webb gave a speech that was rather longer than it needed to be, and Frank spoke briefly about what accurate timekeeping had come to mean to Redemption Creek specifically, and the specific case that had made it mean that. When he said the name Pearl Barrett, the crowd applauded with a warmth that had nothing performative about it. Pearl stood beside Frank in the November cold and looked at the clock tower against the blue afternoon sky, and Frank looked at her looking at it, and he saw something in her face that he had seen before in small moments, the expression of a person who has made something that will outlast them, and who knows it, and who finds in that knowledge not melancholy but something like completion. He put his hand against the small of her back, a private gesture in the public crowd, and she leaned slightly into it without looking away from the clock, and the bell struck the hour with a clean, true sound that rang out over the town and the surrounding land and drifted away into the wide, clear, New Mexico sky. Eli Marsh, who was by now married and running a small freight operation and doing well, was standing near the front of the crowd with his wife, and he looked up at the clock and looked across the crowd at Pearl and Frank and raised his hand in a gesture that was simple and complete, and Frank raised his back. Some debts, Frank had learned, were not about money. They were about the particular kind of gratitude that arises when someone uses their best and most specific gift to prevent the worst from happening. Pearl had done that. She had done it because she was who she was, because the information was what the situation required, because honesty was more efficient than silence. But she had done it, and the consequences of her doing it radiated outward from that September day in ways that none of them could fully track or measure, except that they could feel it. In the clock tower and the clean ring of its bell, in Eli Marsh's raised hand, in James and Clara playing at the edge of the crowd with the unself-conscious energy of children who have no idea how everything might have been different if someone hadn't cared enough to open a notebook and write a number down. Frank put his arm around Pearl properly then, unconcerned with who was watching, and she turned her face up to him with the full and warm expression that he stored in the same private collection, where he kept all the expressions that were only for him, and he kissed her in the middle of the inauguration crowd with the clock tower bell still fading in the air around them. There were a few people in the crowd who noticed and smiled. Mrs. Hodge, who noticed everything, pressed her hands together. Judge Poole looked at the sky with the expression of a man making a note in an internal record that he would not be sharing with anyone. The years that followed had the quality of years lived in a good place and a good time. Not without difficulty, not without loss, not without the ordinary heartbreaks and challenges that any life must contain, but fundamentally sound, fundamentally true. Pearl's business continued to grow with the expansion of the railway and the increasing complexity of modern commerce, which depended on synchronized time in ways that would have been inconceivable a generation earlier. She hired more staff, trained more apprentices, and became in the 1890s one of the most widely recognized horologers in the American Southwest, respected by the railways and the observatories and the growing body of scientific institutions that were establishing themselves in the region. She continued to travel and continued to come home, and the coming home never became ordinary or reduced by repetition. Frank met every stage she returned on. James and Clara, when they were old enough, came with him. James grew into a young man who was, as Frank had always suspected he would be, fundamentally a horseman and a frontiersman in the way that his father was, with a directness and a physical ease in the world that was recognizably Bancroft. He also had his mother's precision of observation, applied to the natural world rather than mechanical systems, and by the time he was 14, he was apprenticing with a surveyor and showing a facility for the work that the surveyor described, with the tone of a man who has encountered something genuinely unusual, as extraordinary. Clara grew into a young woman with her mother's steady, measuring intelligence and her father's particular moral seriousness, and she developed a deep interest in the educational needs of the territory's children, an interest that eventually became her life's work. She was teaching in a school in Santa Fe by the time she was 19, and she was, by all accounts, exceptional at it. Frank and Pearl grew older together with the particular grace of people who have always been honest with each other. The gray at Frank's temples spread and deepened until his hair was predominantly silver, which suited the architecture of his face in a way that Pearl told him directly. Pearl's hair, when she let it down in the privacy of their home, was streaked with silver by her early 40s in a way that Frank found beautiful with the same unconditional clarity that he found everything about her beautiful, not despite the passage of time but including it. He retired as sheriff in 1897 after 14 years, handing the badge to Cal Reeves, who had been his deputy since the beginning and was, Frank believed, exactly the right person to carry the work forward. The retirement party that the town threw was the kind of event that a community puts together when it is expressing something genuine, and Frank sat through the speeches and the toasts with Pearl beside him, and felt the accumulated weight and meaning of the 14 years as something he could be proud of. He was 50 years old when he retired. Pearl was 44. They were in the fine prime of a life that had everything it needed. He took up the management of a small land parcel east of town that he had acquired over the years, turning it to cattle as he had known how to do since Texas, on a scale that was sustainable and satisfying. Pearl continued her work with the concentration and devotion that had always characterized it. They had the house, and the clocks, and the land, and each other. On the evening of their 15th wedding anniversary, in January of 1898, Frank found Pearl in her workshop with the lamplight falling over her hands and the chronometer open before her, making some small adjustment with a tool as delicate as a surgeon's instrument, and he stood in the doorway and watched her for a long time before she heard him. There was something about watching her work that had never lost its quality. It was like watching a proof being demonstrated, the rightness of a person in their element, the satisfaction of seeing a mind and a skill deployed at full capacity. She looked up and saw him and set down the tool. 15 years, he said. 15 years, she agreed. He came in and sat in the chair beside her work table, and they looked at each other in the lamplight. Outside, the January wind moved over the land, and from somewhere in the house a clock struck the hour, full and clear and precise. "I have been thinking," Pearl said, with the tone that meant she had been thinking carefully about something for some time, about something my father used to say. "Tell me," Frank said. "He said that a clock that is well made and well maintained will outlast its maker by centuries. He said the work endures." She looked at her hands, her extraordinary, capable hands. "I used to think that was about clocks." Frank looked at her, waited. "I think now," Pearl said, "that it is about everything, the work we do, the things we build, the people we raise, the honesty we practice." She met his eyes, and in them was everything they had made together, the whole of the 15 years, the house and the children and the clock tower and the cases solved and the mistakes corrected and the mornings and the evenings and the 1,001 conversations. "It endures." Frank took her hand across the work table and held it, her watchmaker's hand, still precise and capable and warm, and he said, "It does." Outside, the January wind. Inside, the lamp, the clocks, the warmth of a house that was fully and completely a home. Pearl looked at her husband's face, the face she had known for 16 years now, the face that had looked at her with shock and then wonder in a courtroom on a September afternoon and had been looking at her with love ever since. "I think we should have another year like last year," she said. "Every year should be like last year," Frank said. Pearl smiled, the full and unguarded smile. "That's ambitious." "I've been known to be ambitious," he said. "You have," she agreed. And then, with the directness and warmth and certainty that were her most fundamental qualities, "I love you, Frank Bancroft." He looked at her across the work table in the lamplight with the clocks ticking their steady and accurate time all around them. "I love you, Pearl Barrett," he said, keeping her name as she had kept it in her work, because it was the name of the woman he had fallen in love with, and it was right and true and precise. She laughed, a small, warm sound, and she turned back to the chronometer and picked up her tool with the ease of returning to something beloved. And Frank sat beside her in the lamp-warm workshop of their home and listened to the clocks and the wind and the sound of his wife working, and felt the world exactly as it was, which was to say, very good indeed. The clock tower in the center of Redemption Creek stood for decades after the people who built it were gone, its bell marking the hours through the days and seasons and years, reliable and honest, its movement maintained according to the manual Pearl Barrett had written in her precise and careful hand. A document that became a point of local pride and was eventually housed in the New Mexico Territorial Archives as a record of the particular and extraordinary kind of expertise that had come to the town in a heavy leather satchel on a bright September morning in 1882. Those who read it found in its pages not just the technical specifications of a mechanical system, but the record of a mind that had understood, with absolute and generous clarity, that the difference between what the clock shows and what the time actually is can mean everything or nothing, depending entirely on whether someone bothers to measure carefully and tell the truth. In Redemption Creek, someone had. And Redemption Creek, in all the ways that mattered, had been the better for it ever since.